Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 248 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you ask someone on the street today to describe a medieval street, they would probably say it was filthy and muddy, and that's exactly how people liked it. Listeners to this podcast will know this is not actually how people liked it, and they took steps to actively avoid living in filth. But how did they accomplish it? What were some of the ground rules? And how did this change when your city was also surrounded by water? This week, I spoke with Dr. Jane Stevens Crawshaw about environmental policies in 14th and 15th century Genoa and Venice. Jane is a senior lecturer in early modern European history and the deputy head for strategy and development in the School of Education, Humanities, and Languages at Oxford Brookes University. She's the author of Plague Hospitals, Public Health for the City in Early Modern Venice, and the co-editor of The Place of the Social Margins, 1350 to 1750. Her new book is Cleaning Up Renaissance Italy, Environmental Ideals and Urban Practice in Genoa and Venice. Our conversation on the health and moral concerns at the heart of environmental policy, whose job it was to keep things clean, and the complications of cleaning up such watery cities is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Jane, for joining me to talk about environmental concerns in Italy. It's so nice to meet you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so this is very exciting for me. We did talk on the podcast about some environmental concerns in Paris, but that is a landlocked city, even though it has a big river in it. And this is a completely different set of characteristics when it comes to cities. So you picked Genoa and Venice. Why did you pick these two cities?
Thinking about where they're positioned, we're at the top of Italy, but on the eastern and western side, they're two really important ports in the period that I'm working on, which is the 15th and 16th century. And in lots of ways, they've spent centuries kind of looking at one another, being rivals, trying to compete for that dominance in the kind of mercantile environment. And I chose them really because they're two quite large, economically important cities. But in the period that I work on, they haven't actually tended to be looked at together. So in an earlier period, it's quite common to talk about Venice and Genoa. By the time you get to the 15th and 16th centuries, their paths have diverted a little. But obviously that environmental connection, your two large ports that have similar sorts of challenges, that's still there. And I thought it would be interesting to pick up the story of how their experiences of managing that environment, differs, but also where we might see points of intersection and, where they're similar.
Yeah, I think comparing things is always useful. Plus, you get twice the knowledge, right? So you have picked the 15th and 16th centuries, and you mentioned in the book that this is kind of a middle space where it's not the Middle Ages, not quite the modern period. Why have you picked these two centuries to look at?
I think so much of what we tend to do now in terms of the spheres of managing health, public health and the environment, we could really trace back to this period. It's a time when both of these cities are really wealthy and they're looking around thinking, we can invest in the state. What should this be doing? And people are talking about the responsibilities of the state. And I guess that's one of the things that's always interested me in my work. There are probably two big questions that I love to think about. One is, what's the purpose of the state? Why is it there? And the other one is, how do people understand the relationship between people and the place that they live in? So how do they think people are shaped by the environments they're within? And I guess a port environment allows me to ask that second question in some quite specific ways. And the period that I've chosen allows me to think a little bit about how ideas around the state and its responsibilities are changing.
Yes, and I think when it comes to the state and its responsibilities, this is something that is really being shaped and has a huge part of policy, environmental policy, as it does today. So I think it's time to take 1 second to tell us, what does it look like in these two states or in these two cities, however we want to think about them in this particular period, so that we have an idea of who's making decisions when it comes to things like environmental policy.
Yeah. So Venice and Genoa are both cities, but they're both controlling territories, right? So they've got a kind of reach that stretches beyond the city. And in terms of who's in charge, there's quite a large state in both cities. They're both using political systems they're both operating as republics. So in theory, if we start with Venice, you've got at the top the figurehead of the Doge, who is elected from the group of kind of power holders, the main council in the city. That's only men. And at different times over the course of the period I work on, the kind of age requirement changes a little bit. And it's also only the elite men, the wealthiest, those whose position is kind of enshrined right at the top of the social hierarchy. And all of the government bodies are essentially staffed, often on rotation, by members of this political, social, economic elite. And in Genoa, it's a slightly more complicated story, but those same principles of those who are in power are essentially those who come from the leading political families of the city, sometimes with a bit of external oversight for Genoa. But most of the kind of day-to-day business is still done by councils, magistracies, parts of the government that are staffed by the leading families of the city, the men mm-hmm. from the leading families of the city.
And when it comes to a culture in these two cities, does it feel as if these men who are meant to be on the council have this responsibility for the city, or is it something that they just sort of have to show up to every once in a while? Like, is there a civic idea of responsibility that they are taking on when they come of age and have to sit on the council?
Yeah, I mean, you get probably, as you would expect, people who take this responsibility, some take it more seriously than others. But I guess there's also a sort of self-interested part to taking this seriously, in that there is a kind of hierarchy of roles. And the idea would be that you progress from some of the more kind of entry-level positions and you try to ascend the ladder. That gives your family greater influence in the city. And ultimately, one of the great aims is to end up as this figurehead position, the Doge. And that takes a lot of political experience. The age at which someone is elected Doge on average is, well into what we would consider old age in this period. And that's because it's supposed to come at the end of a political career. Mm-hmm. And in order to, in theory, there's supposed to be a system for election that means that it's, in effect, a bit random. But of course, in practice, there's a huge amount of influencing that goes on. And so it's in your interests to exercise kind of an effective political career. That's not the same as doing what you were just saying, which is taking genuine responsibility. But I think what I would say, and one of the things that I argue in the book, is that there is a kind of commitment to environmental management that comes down to some much bigger ideas around, how does a well-run city operate? There's a clear understanding that when visitors come to the city, they want to be impressed by beautiful buildings and clean streets. And so the men who are working in these careers know very well that the way in which the city looks, the fact that it has clean and effective provision of water and so on, that all plays a really important role in shaping external perceptions. And so that sense of civic pride, I think, is definitely there and is part of what motivates these individuals in the work that they oversee.
Yeah, especially if you're placing your city in competition with the other one, you want to make sure that yours looks great, feels great, that people want to come back there.
Yeah, absolutely. And throughout this period, one of the sort of undercurrents is about, I suppose, picking up that mantle of who is going to be seen as the next big leading European city. That kind of idea that you might become the kind of new Rome, thinking back to the great achievements of Rome in the past. And part of that was associated with engineering and effective management of the environment, water supply, and so on. And so, I think there are those political kind of associations and connotations that link achievements in this sphere with that sense of running a good city, that it's kind of taken as representative. If you can make sure that your citizens are well supplied with the necessities and your streets are clean, that speaks to the care that you have as a governing class.
Yes. And one of the things that runs through the book as well is that having clean streets and taking care of the people also shows that you are morally good, which is something that is important as well. So can you tell us a bit about the moral character of cleanliness when it comes to city streets?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the things that really interests me about if somebody in the 15th and 16th century wants to say, how do I ensure not only that people from the outside think really highly of my city, but also that we achieve that sort of social and political serenity, that it's stable, that we operate a society that's kind of happy and productive and so on, those things, the kind of ideals around governance, a really big part of that is believed to come through the form of the city. Are the streets wide and light and clean and bright with air that smells fresh, or are they dark and overcrowded and full of rubbish and so on? And what's really interesting about the framework of ideas that govern how people think about their bodies is that there's such a close connection between the environment that you're living in and the health of your body. And the health of your body is partly about, do you have disease? But it's also about what's your personality? What's your temperament? If you find yourself in a situation, do you respond in a way that's, enthusiastic and positive and calm? Or do you respond in a way that's aggressive or melancholic? And a lot of that comes from your environment. So the sort of key ideas in that are things like balance. There's supposed to be balance in the environment, thinking about the quality of air. You don't want it too full of moisture. You don't want it too dry. And thinking about individual bodies, the idea is that you should try to have things in moderation. So you eat carefully, you try to get good sleep and so on. And you don't sleep too much, you don't sleep too little. There's a real sense of, if you can try to get balance in the way that you live your life, that will bring to the fore those kind of qualities that are good for you as an individual, but those who are running the government would say is also good in a kind of collective sense. And so that's what they want to try and encourage as well. And so one of the things that really interests me is where this responsibility lies. How much of this is about individuals taking choices about what they eat, how they sleep, where they live, how much they clean, and how much of it is about the state saying, well, actually, if you do those things well, then that has an impact on the state. But also if you do those things, you make choices that we don't encourage, that also has a kind of negative impact on society. So how much should we intervene to try and make a difference in this? And I guess some of those questions, carry on to the present day about where is the responsibility of the state in that. In this period, it particularly focuses in on things like how clean houses should be and who decides how regularly things should be cleaned.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's dive into that. So when it comes to individual responsibility, can you give us a sense of what people are expected to do with the local environment where they live? So the street in front of their house, the canal in front of their house, or behind their house, what is their responsibility individually, sort of in general?
Yeah, so it's most commonly articulated in terms of how many times you should clean. So in Genoa, for example, the expectation is every Saturday morning that you should clean in front of your house or your workshop. And that if, when you come outside, you kind of looked at the parameters of your property, if there's really clearly a mess just a little bit further down, that you not only have responsibility for that sort of immediate space outside your door, but you should be keeping an eye on the street, perhaps the square nearby, and so on. But it's that weekly cleaning. And you would also be asked to do that if there was a big feast day or important civic festival coming up, then you would be expected to undertake more regular cleaning. What starts happening increasingly through the period that I'm working on, though, is that those responsibilities for the sort of householder or the person who owns the workshop come to be supplemented by cleaning that might be organised at parish level. So the state starts organising and in some cases paying for employees to come in and to start supplementing that cleaning, or perhaps to start clearing the waste. So you start to see more of this week to week cleaning being a bit of a collaboration between householders who continue to fulfill that responsibility and increasingly individuals that are employed by the government to perhaps move some of that waste once it's been cleared from outside households, to clean wells when those need undertaking, but also to start focusing in on overseeing that cleanliness of the streets, supplementing it where it's needed, targeting that at squares and so on. So it starts to very clearly emerge as something that is both the expectation of the householder and something that there's a role for state employed cleaners to undertake.
Yeah, I imagine it would be very hard to keep everything clean if you're just doing it by yourself, especially because There are other people who are not as concerned about it. And one of my favorite images from the book is that Venice hires 2 people per section who are going to take their boats down the canal and collect all the garbage. And this is not a job that many people want, but it's an essential job. And I just imagine being one of those bargemen going down and collecting the waste in the middle of the canal. I can't imagine how awful that would smell, but it's an important job. Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, they're essential jobs. And there are quite a few of these that emerge in the period. I mean, similarly, cleaning out a well is going to be a pretty unpleasant job to undertake in this period. These jobs, if we remember how much of this is being done, entirely by hand, there are some forms of technology that come to be developed. And that's one of the things that I get interested in the book part of the way through is how the state starts to try to encourage some inventions that might be used perhaps to clean wells more efficiently or to move waste. But a lot of this remains hugely time intensive, energy intensive, a real kind of battling against the elements. So as you say, in lots of ways, it's undesirable work, but it's work for which there is ongoing demand. In lots of ways, it's certainly not easy work, but it is work that is kind of continuous. A lot of work in this period is seasonal. There's some degree of seasonality to this, but actually that what the seasons change is, I suppose, the conditions in which you're doing the work. This is work that's needed all year round. So there is that side of it that actually makes it in some ways quite an attractive prospect, but the work would still be hard. There would be a kind of reliable demand for it, but difficult work.
Yes. And speaking of difficult work, one of the other things I found really fascinating about this is imagining what it's like to live in a port city. And I'm thinking more about Genoa in this case, where you have the port always getting clogged up with things like shipwrecks. And this is something that a person who has always lived in a landlocked place never thinks about for me. But occasionally you have shipwrecks and there become regulations on how quickly you need to clean up the shipwrecks and whose job it is. So tell us a little bit about shipwrecks that are happening right in the middle of the port.
Yeah, so this is something that in Genoa, as you say, the authorities are really concerned about the depth of the port. And they're battling all the time with these natural processes of siltation. And Genoa is built on a really steep incline. So there is a real sense that things also get flushed down when it rains from the city into the port. And that affects the depth of water. And in turn, the shallower the water in the port, the more vulnerable ships are thought to be in times of severe storm. And there are a number of these in Genoa. The other thing that makes a difference in terms of shipwrecks is just the changing technology around the dimensions of boats. I mentioned at the beginning that both Genoa and Venice are really important ports. That's central to their economy. It's also so important in terms of how they bring foodstuffs into the city. Neither of these cities is producing much in the way of foodstuffs within the city. In this kind of period, often you would have, as you were talking about, if you have a landlocked city, you'd often have city walls with some areas set aside for gardens and so on. Genoa and Venice are different in this regard. And so a lot of the essential commodities are coming in through the port. And Genoa in particular, because of this steep incline, because it's so mountainous, overland transportation is really challenging. So most of the things that have to come into Genoa use the port. So keeping that accessible is so important, keeping it safe, thinking about where do you situate a lighthouse? How often should it be manned? How should that be different in winter versus summer? These are all things that the authorities are having to work through. And that's why I think it's really interesting to undertake a comparison, because lots of the challenges are similar, but the specific contexts are distinct and the solutions that the authorities come up with are a bit distinct. So definitely a problem around keeping that port accessible. And one of the things that is particularly testing in Genoa is that sense of, in the aftermath of a severe storm, who's responsible for getting not only the actual vessel of the ship, but some of the cargo. There are people who start to specialize in things like salvage in the aftermath of a shipwreck. But all of this is quite contested because obviously there's a value to salvage. The salvage operators are interested in doing this. The owner of the vessel might well be interested in trying to reclaim some of their cargo. The state's involved because of the issues of the accessibility of the port. So you end up with these situations that are quite contested in terms of who's responsible. Again, this sort of coming back to whose responsibility is it? These are things that the authorities are trying to work through. There's no kind of single answer to any of that, but lots of interested parties.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about salvage, especially because when we're talking about cleaning garbage and things like that, it becomes a specialized thing, something that you do and do by hand. And salvage in a time before people have air tanks is a specialized thing. You have to be able to hold your breath long enough to go and do that. So, it becomes something that you get hired just to do. And so you could probably charge quite a lot for that, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's definitely something that there is money behind. A bit like we were saying earlier, this is difficult and challenging work. There are all sorts of technologies that are tried around raising ships and salvage that aren't always successful. It's a high risk operation. And the specific context of each shipwreck poses different challenges. So you could have someone who's operated quite successfully in one context and then, encounters a problem with the next. But it is an opportunity for money making if you're able to build up your reputation. But it's also one of the things that interests me in the book is it is a way of making a living, but it's also a way of finding your place in a port society. So, we've talked a little bit about what makes a port distinctive, and it's partly the environment, but it's also partly the changes that occur in the population, that sense of the turnover of people. That these are both cities that individuals are moving to and then going away from. That sense of migration is quite high. And having a skill like this, that like we were saying earlier with the rubbish clearing, there is going to be demand for, because this is a common challenge in ports, is one of the things that enables people to move between port cities and to try and settle with their families in port cities. Because this is a time when, apart from that political elite I was talking about earlier, very few people have that uncontested right to live and work in a city. That sense of citizenship is much more limited, particularly in Venice. And so having something that is so obviously of value to the place that you're trying to settle in can be really powerful and significant for individuals. So we see examples of those who are not from Venice or Genoa offering inventions, offering some sort of technology or skill or expertise. And that's one of the ways in which they're able to potentially access the structures of the city.
I think that's a very important point, and one that you get at throughout the book, where when it comes to cleanliness, morality, and all of these things, it also comes to that stratification of society. So you do have people who are living near the port, and that's where they should live. So what are some other ways that people are sort of gating off communities and deciding who should live where so that the streets are clean and moral? You have some people who are labeled as problematic in these cities. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, you do. And this is absolutely a time when the authorities do decide in different times and at different places that there are certain groups of people, first of all, that just shouldn't have a place. So there are examples where a government will decide, often because of a concern, that would be articulated as a concern around health, where they might expel anyone who's living on the streets, anyone who's begging and not of that city. The idea being that those individuals should return to the city of their origin. You also have particular either religious or ethnic groups that are clustered, again, particularly in Venice. It's in Venice in the period that I'm interested in, so in 1516, that you have the Jewish community that's located on an island in the city that becomes known as the ghetto. So this is where our word of ghetto and a ghettoization comes from, is this Venetian context, because the island on which the community is housed had previously been used for the waste products from an iron foundry. And in Italian, that verb of sort of throwing away a waste product is gettare, to throw away. And so the island is known as the ghetto, which then becomes known as the ghetto. So this is absolutely a time when the authorities are thinking really carefully about the place of people, trying to locate carefully groups that are either seen from a moral point of view as being problematic or potentially dangerous, in need of some additional oversight and control, but also economic activities that might pose a threat to health. So some of those necessary but potentially quite noxious activities like tanning is a kind of classic example or the butchering of meat is thought of really carefully in terms of where you can do that in relation to, the flow of water through a city, what other activities might be nearby, other residential areas, and so on. So there's a lot of thought given to particular groups and also particular activities. And the desire is to place those very carefully. And I think that mapping of kind of concern onto specific locations is definitely a feature of the period that I work on in Italy, where there's a much clearer discussion of, does that activity or group belong in our city? If not, then it will be simply rejected or removed. If it belongs, where does it need to be located in order for it to pose, or for us to kind of mitigate as far as possible any threat that it could pose to the wider residents and citizens of that place?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the places where our ideas about environment definitely diverge. They're separate from how people are thinking about this in the Middle Ages, because we would never think of people as an environmental concern in terms of their beliefs or moral decision making or anything like that. But in this time and place, it is all very conflated as these are all environmental concerns. And I think it's important to think about that. So often I'm trying to bring people together and recognize a common humanity, but there are some cultural differences that are immense. And this is one of them, I think.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. That language of cleanliness and dirt is one that's used really widely. It's used with a kind of social and a medical and a moral ramification in this period. And there is a sense that when some of the activities that I'm interested in, things like street cleaning or diverting a river or cleaning a port, that's also justified as something that will have an impact on each of those things. So yeah, absolutely. It's about improving the physical health of a place. But there's also a belief that it will potentially change people's behaviors, that it will make them behave better. So this idea of why would a state undertake this? The things that really interest me are that in the sphere of the environment, there's partly a political motivation that we were talking about earlier, that idea of presenting your city well, what a state is designed to do. There's an economic one because, ports need access and trade and connection. But there's also this social and religious element that I think when we've thought about these things in the past has tended not to receive so much attention. But in the period that I work on, it's a really important part. It's not the only motivation for these things, but it sits alongside the others as a significant one.
And I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to be part of that evolution in moving from ideas in the Middle Ages to ideas that are early modern, where these things might not have been so clearly articulated in terms of this is the spot where we need to put certain groups of people, for example. I think this is something that seems to come out of the Middle Ages, but it's not necessarily from that time. Did this feel sort of like a transition for you?
I think a lot of the ideas are already there in the earlier period. But I think that there's a kind of intensity to what happens in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries that is different, because cities, this is a time when cities are growing, but the infrastructure is not necessarily keeping pace. So that sense of understanding what the impact of these groups or activities can be is felt more keenly. And I think also this is a time when both Venice and Genoa, as I was saying earlier, have quite a degree of wealth. They're able to do more that is ambitious in this regard. So I think there's a kind of continuity with the earlier period in terms of the ideas don't change, but I think that the activities become more numerous, they become more ambitious, they're clearer. So I think you're right, this is a transition time, not because people are necessarily thinking differently, but they're kind of acting more in this sphere, I think.
Yes, you've articulated that much better than I could. So, okay, we are on the same page. Thank you for clarifying that. So we're talking about wealth, and this is sort of, in a way, trivial, but in a way very important. When we're talking about how to fund activities, Genoa came up with a solution. It's not entirely their own, but they decided they were going to pay for a lot of public works through the lottery. Can you tell us about early lotteries?
It's a really striking part of what happens in Genoa. And as you say, not in Venice. I mean, lotteries do happen in Venice, but they're not used to kind of fund activities in quite the same way. So what the government starts to do is to run regular lotteries. People would buy a ticket, much as we would expect today. There are different prices and there are prizes at the end, but they're very much couched as something that fit within this kind of moral society that you were talking about earlier. So a lot of what the government does is to try to reassure people that there's nothing immoral about participating in a state-run lottery, because in a Catholic society there would have been concern about, gambling is definitely thought of as something that is of concern. It's something that the authorities try and regulate. It's associated with other kind of moral concerns in this period, like excessive drinking and so on. But the state-run lotteries are situated differently by the government. They're often launched or closed on a religious festival. The kind of draw would take place often in and around a church. So there is a real desire by the authorities to try to say to people, this is a way of doing good and funding works like repairs on the city's aqueduct or something else of that sort. So it's a really distinctive part of the way in which Genoa tries to raise money, because all of these, or many of these activities that I talk about in the book are really very, very expensive. So, dredging in this period, for many of the reasons that we've mentioned earlier, partly how manual the labor has to be. They're huge undertakings, these projects. So they require a big labor force, but they also require, quite a degree of investment. And so too does the maintenance of the infrastructure for carrying water, like the aqueduct and the pipes and the city's fountains and so on. So part of the issues that the government's always trying to weigh up is, first of all, in theory, what's the responsibility of the state? But also in practice, what can the state do? What do we have the funds to do? What do we have the knowledge and expertise to do? And so the really big infrastructure projects do tend to be funded by the government. But on a smaller scale, you sometimes do see elite families stepping in and doing things like repairing a well or a fountain, and then marking that in some way with a plaque or a coat of arms or something, so that everybody knows that they've done that, as part, again, of trying to, I suppose, express that sense of what an elite family is supposed to do for its community. So, a number of different ways in which the funding for these things are developed. But a distinctive element to the playing of lotteries in Genoa.
I love it because you have an example in the book where people are like, I can't wait until I win the lottery. I'm going to get a new shirt.
That's right.
It's just so familiar, this idea of like getting a lottery ticket, because here in Canada, where I'm from, we have the same thing where the lottery is used for public service. And so it's a good thing to buy a ticket, but at the same time, you're also having that selfish impulse, like, what am I going to do if I win the lottery? So it's so familiar.
Absolutely. I remember thinking the same thing. It's similar here in the UK in terms of what, the lottery money can be used for. And when I was reading through those tickets, it was just fascinating to see the sorts of things that people were hoping might come out that they'd written onto their tickets. You were talking earlier about, when you look back, there are those moments where you can really find a point of resonance. And then other times that where, the past feels so different and distinct. And that's one of the things I love about the period I work on, that you get both of those things in equal measure. Sometimes you have those touch points and you think that feels so strikingly kind of something that I could experience today or tomorrow. And other times when it's so different. And definitely the lottery tickets, the aspirations, that sort of sense of, kind of common humanity of what you would be hoping for is definitely in the familiar camp.
Yes, absolutely. Or as you're saying, having a rich family that's making a donation, but they also put their name on it. Like, how many hospital wings have people's names on them, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's a big part. We've spoken about the responsibility of the state, but there's that kind of other side. And, in lots of ways, there's a lot of overlap because, as I said, a number of these families are in effect staffing the state in this period, or certainly, overseeing the work of the government. And that point about, what makes you elite is really much talked about in this period, because in places like Venice and Genoa, where there's a port and there's a huge amount of trade, there's an opportunity to make money. And so there are people who are becoming quite wealthy, but who are not part of those elite families. And that comes to be thought of by those elite families as quite problematic, challenging. There are all sorts of measures that are taken in response. And part of the spur behind some of the laws about the clothes that you can wear, how much you can spend on different festivities and so on, comes precisely out of this concern that people are kind of overspending. They're spending in a way that doesn't reflect their place in this very fixed social, economic, political hierarchy. They're behaving as though they're elite when they're not. And being elite in this period was, in theory at least, very tightly controlled. So in Venice, there's a golden book. And if your family's name is in this book, then you are part of the social and political elite. And if it's not, then you're not. And you shouldn't be behaving like you are. You shouldn't necessarily be spending like you are. And so, texts get written in this period about what it should be to be a member of the elite, what your responsibilities are, but also how you should behave. What sort of qualities should you possess? And I think this is all kind of part of some of the motivation for undertaking works like this in communities, that sense of what an elite family is there to do for its immediate community, often located around a particularly grand palace. What should that behavior look like?
It's interesting because this, to me, feels related to what we were just saying about ideas from the Middle Ages sort of being locked down, codified, and all of those things. Because one of the things I thought was interesting, again, this case being Genoa, where people leave money to the city to do good works, especially in terms of the port. And then it becomes sort of codified as in everyone needs to leave money in their wills so that it can go towards the port. And that's kind of an interesting transition where you're taking things like charitable giving that are meant to be sort of just part of your moral character and then making it happen as if it must happen. And that's interesting, I think, related to your ideas of controlling who is elite and how they behave in terms of environment, sort of interlinked.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what comes to happen, this is in a number of different areas, is that governments can ask the notaries who write down the wills to ask specific questions. And I came across this in my first research project, in which I was working about plague and quarantine and how we develop a kind of system of quarantine. And the government in Venice says that notaries need to ask those who are making their wills whether or not they want to leave money to support, the kind of public health system, the hospitals that are in place. And it definitely is one of these areas where governments are trying to come up with new ways of ensuring that they have the funds to do the work, both that they want to do and that the residents, citizens of their cities expect them to do. And I think that kind of tension that we were talking about earlier, where you have the expectations and the intentions, and then you have the restrictions of how much these things cost. This is the kind of environment in which governments start asking for more of those private donations to a number of these works and trying to be clear about what the benefit is for those individuals. And in this Catholic context, the fact that this is being written into a will, there's a very clear message that the benefit of doing this good work is received by your soul after death. This is how some of this is being articulated when it's being talked about in this context of will making and so on. So there's that sense that your name or your insignia gets put on a street or an element of the infrastructure, but there's also something really personal and significant in this Catholic context about doing some of these good works for your community.
I think that this whole book and this conversation is really going to make it clear to people just how deeply everyone is thinking about all of these things and how they work together and how they can make things better, both environmentally, morally, whether we agree with their parameters or not. I think that it really speaks to the complexity of the way people are thinking about this stuff in the past. So thank you so much, Jane, for coming on and talking to us about environmental concerns, moral concerns, and all of this happening in Italian cities. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
To find out more about Jane's work, you can visit her faculty page at Oxford Brookes University or follow her on X at JLSC_Hist. Her new book is Cleaning Up Renaissance Italy, Environmental Ideals and Urban Practice in Genoa and Venice. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, Antiquity Journal, it's one of those big academic journals that we all kind of love to read. They gave out their prize for their best article. And unsurprisingly, they picked one of their own articles. But it's by a quartet of medievalists. It's called Rethinking the Green Revolution.
Nice.
Yeah, so it was all about the idea that Arab expansion in the 8th century, 9th century kind of led to new crops and new practices of agriculture throughout the Mediterranean, and had this kind of boom that went on for the next couple of centuries. And the original thinking was it was just because of the Arab expansion. But these researchers took a look more and looked at how climate change also affected it. A little broader view of what was kind of going on with agriculture. But these were good times if you were a farmer in the Mediterranean.
I would love to be a farmer in the Mediterranean. No, I wouldn't. I'd be a terrible farmer. But congratulations to the winners.
Indeed. So we have that. Other good news, eCodices, this the Swiss manuscript archive online. They added 30 more manuscripts. Woohoo!
Nice. That's awesome.
So there's some really lovely ones, some that were from a Franciscan nunnery in the 15th century, some really lovely images, even way back into the 9th century, some Carolingian stuff has been added. Plus, we also have been doing articles for Steve Tibble's new book, Crusader Criminals, which is coming right about now. And it's been lovely having Steve write these kind of pieces that are a little bit based on the book. But man, the Crusades were a violent time. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, just a little bit. Just a little bit. It's kind of the entire point.
Indeed. But this is all violence directed against each other. Just, get your servants, get your political enemies, just have fun. Just attack whoever.
I think we have different ideas about what's fun, but that's okay. To each his own, right?
Indeed. Did I tell you that I studied medieval violence when I started my graduate career? So, yay.
Right. And I studied literature. So that tells you a lot, I think, right there. Well, thank you, Peter, for coming on the podcast and telling us what's on the website. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I can't believe it, but it's already the season finale of my mini-series, This is History Presents The Iron King. In this final episode, we find out just how far Philip the Fair is willing to go to safeguard his dynasty, and the way it spectacularly blows up in his face. We'll also find out how the Iron King meets his end and what people have to say about him after he dies. And we'll be introduced to one of my favorite historical figures, Isabella of France, a fierce defender of her family's honor, whose story will be at the heart of Dan Jones's next season of This is History, which starts up right after mine. And on our last episode of This is History Plus, we keep it real when it comes to medieval executions, and Dan finishes off the series with a bang with his dynamite zombie pope impression. You can find The Iron King wherever you listen to this podcast, and you can try This is History Plus for free at thisishistorypod.com. Thank you, as always, for all your support, especially if you're a patron on patreon.com, because patrons are the wind beneath my wings and allow me to do this work in the first place. If you'd like to become a patron, please head over to patreon.com/medievalists. Or if you'd like to support my work another way, you can visit tpublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet to pick up some sweet medieval merch and show off your awesomeness. And if you do, take a picture and tag me so I can say thank you. For everything from ports to shorts, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.